Welcome to the ChiefPricingOfficer.com podcast. I'm your host, John Norkus, and today's episode is entitled Pricing in the Zone of Indifference, and we'll get to that in just a moment. It's a pleasure to be joined by Jim Vaughn, one of those leaders who has spent a career making pricing actionable, not just theoretical. With a career that started at West Point, thank you for your service, and an experience in operations research, Jim has more than 3 decades of battles and victories across 25 plus industry verticals, B2B, B2C, and B2B2C, helping organizations live inside disciplined, market-aligned decisioning. He's the author of Stop Racing in a Blindfold and a longtime contributor to the Professional Pricing Society community, with a reputation for translating pricing science into practical guidance that sales teams will actually use. While Jim's formal title is Global Head of Pricing Advisory at Zilliant, his views have been formed for the last 35 years in pricing. We have the benefit of Jim speaking on his own behalf today as a fellow chief pricer. Welcome, Jim. Good to see you.
Yeah, hey, thanks so much. I appreciate the very flattering introduction. Not all that, but I'll certainly take it. And I do appreciate the fact that, and I'm sure everybody else does, with 35 years of doing this, yeah, I've seen lots of good answers and lots of maybe not so good answers. And so I hopefully bring some perspective that's helpful. And I am speaking on my own part, not specifically from a Zilliant point of view. So I'm not going to advocate anything that Zilliant does. I'm simply going to give you my insight, my opinion.
Well, thank you. It's good to have you here. So let's dig in. We're going to talk about zone of indifference. And this is something that when I talk about it, it's not widely known, but when explained, it's widely embraced. And so when we say zone of indifference, what are some of the symptoms that you've seen that would indicate that a company or perhaps group would benefit from understanding what it is and taking advantage of it?
Yeah, I think if you take the whole conversation up a level,
Mm-hmm.
the question is always one of what am I missing when I start thinking about the risk of making a price move? And what am I exaggerating when I start thinking about the risk of a pricing move? And so I think the zone of indifference, although nobody uses this way, I don't think, I look at it as it's a measure of value-based pricing. That I think is the unique piece here. People talk about, well, we could move our price a little bit or we could move our price a lot, and people are worried about churn and a variety of other things, but they never step back and say, how much does the customer get out of our product or service? And what's the chance that that causes them to want to shop my business? And it's a very interesting topic, so I'm glad we could get a chance to chat about it today.
Wow, I'm glad you said that because it's another voice to speak to the fact that many of my clients are asking me the question, how do I move into value selling? How is it that I can start presenting how good our product is to our customer? And quite frankly, I then respond to, well, what does your customer actually value? That's where we need to start the conversation. Because when we think about value selling, it's not just about continued push on capabilities. It actually has to do with the audience that we're presenting it to. And so one of my first questions is, well, what are your value stories? And then the room
Mhm.
kind of goes silent. And so if you could expand on that a little bit to get us closer to identifying what this zone of indifference means.
Yeah, I mean, I think the value story is really interesting, right? I mean, people immediately jump to, well, how good is the product, right? And we think of a SKU. Well, it's much bigger than a SKU, right? Some businesses don't even have SKUs, right? They still sell something. They don't even have a SKU. It's always a configured to order product or, an engineered to order product, or it's a service. And okay, there's a lot of people in service. So, you know, I think what customer's value, besides avoiding risk, is availability of product, right? I mean, that could be something that has nothing to do with a particular SKU. Maybe it's the breadth of the portfolio that you have that you sell. Maybe you'd meet all of their needs or some of their needs. Maybe it's delivery service quality or options for delivery timing. Maybe it's ordering ease. Maybe it's accuracy in invoicing. All of these other things that wrap around the relationship before you say, well, how good is my product? Well, my product might be bang up, but if my delivery is spotty, then my value to that customer is somewhat degraded, no matter how good the individual product is.
And so, say more about some of the more classic analytics approaches that some of these companies want to take when they get into value selling, and how that is going to come to clash with what it is you just explained, which is it may not just be on price that these decisions are being made.
Yeah, I mean, I tell you what, I don't want to be the company that's selling solely on price, right? Um, if you don't bring something else to the table, right? If the only value you bring to the table is you have the lowest price, then your relationship with that customer is never going to be a robust, growing relationship. There's got to be something else. So I think that's the biggest question that customers have to ask is, I could have two customers side by side, and maybe I'll take an interesting question. If somebody values not waiting in line and somebody doesn't mind waiting in line, they'll wait in line for a lower price. And other people will be willing to pay slightly more if they can avoid the line, right? We see that at entertainment, venues and all kinds of other things. So what is the customer value? What are they willing to pay for is a question. If you go out and do a survey, people will tell you, oh yeah, that's important. But then if you ask them, but would you pay slightly more for that? Sometimes the answer is yes, if you deliver it well. Um, so I think it is an interesting question of what is the customer value, and surveys help, but a lot of times you can derive that same kind of information if you have transactional data. Your data scientist can start to peel that back as well and say, these are things that appear to be associated with slightly higher prices or slightly lower prices. And so this is where data science segmentation intersects with value-based pricing.
Let me take that one step further then, because many clients that I've been talking to say, well, we've got a bunch of transaction data and we'd like
Mhm.
you to come in and do some analytics and set us up so that once we do the analytics, we might have some elasticities indicated, and that will put us in a great position to go and value sell.
Mhm.
What do you find when you come across clients like that?
Well, one of the things we find is that sometimes sales is very dialed in to what the customer really values, and we can see that in the data. And other times, sales thinks something is important, and it actually doesn't show as having any correlation to higher or lower prices. So it is an interesting question at that point where you go back to the customer and you say, is this something that you want to be important, even if historically it hasn't been important? In other words, do you want to go forward, not look backward, but go forward with this as a price differentiator that you believe the market will accept, and then test the market to see if it works?
Okay. So I'm hearing that in most B2B and even some B2B2C or situations, that analytics, while interesting, can inform some ideas about value selling, but value selling is much more than that, isn't it?
It is. It is much more than that. Um,
Okay. So let's talk a little bit now about the notion of the zone of indifference. Um, how would you define that, and how is it similar or dissimilar to some of the more classical things that we learned in Econ 101?
Yeah, I think that the zone of indifference is, in my head, a tolerance zone around how much of a price move you can make. And classically, price versus quantity trade-off, we basically draw it as a downward sloping straight line. Well, it's not really a downward sloping straight line. It's kind of a curve in theory, but in practice, it's more like a staircase. And there's if you are buying at $10 and you've historically been buying around $10 and somebody moves the price 1 or 2%, and you have a great relationship with the vendor and they have good service and their product really meets your needs, are you going to buy the risk of shopping your business to avoid the 1 or 2% price increase? Or are you going to say, the total package is valuable to me. They have most of the products I need. The products are well built. They have a great warranty on them. They don't break. I mean, all the things that you would expect a great product to do for what the user or the buyer is purchasing. And they'll say, sure, I'll take a 2% increase. That's reasonable. We've seen inflation. Okay, they're not asking for an exorbitant number. Now, you turn it around and you say, well, I'm going to have a 12% increase. And they're going to say, they're not that good, right? And that value that you're bringing to me isn't worth a 12% increase, but it's more than worth a 2% increase. So it's this, instead of being a long, smooth curve on the price elasticity kind of idea, it's stair step. And as long as you stay on the same step, you can exploit that zone of indifference to your advantage. You can raise price slightly and you're not going to lose any customers or any demand unless you exceed their zone of indifference.
Aha. So therefore, the challenge is understanding what that zone is and
Mm-hmm.
being able to then maximize it, get it to the furthest point that you can. Now, doesn't that also work in the other direction?
It works, but not necessarily to your advantage.
That's what I meant. Say
Um,
more.
the idea is that, let's say I want to stimulate some small additional demand. I've got some extra capacity coming off my production line, or I've got some stuff in the warehouse that's not selling as fast as I would like it to. And I say, well, let's lower my price ever so slightly. And I'm going to use light bulbs as an example. The light bulb doesn't know if you've lowered your price by 2%, and your customers aren't going to buy more light bulbs if you lower it by 2% because they only have so many light bulbs, in their factory that they need to replace, and they burn out at a very predictable rate. The light bulb isn't going to burn out faster because you lowered the price, right? And so lowering your price slightly, probably very slightly, probably won't stimulate additional demand. And all you're doing is giving away profit dollars. That's an interesting twist. Now, if you lower it sufficiently such that a customer who is sourced from one vendor says, ooh, somebody's offered me a better deal and I can save 3, 4, 5%, maybe I'll test that product to see if it really performs well. And so they might dip their toe in the pool and say, all right, we'll buy a batch from them just to see. But you're not going to stimulate a lot of demand initially from a slightly lower price because, again, customers value avoiding risk.
Right. There's also another piece to this too, which has to do with this zone of indifference that shows up before you are even trying to sell to the organization. And by that, I mean, I find that's a lot of the professional services companies that I work with
Mm-hmm.
fall prey to this notion of negotiating with yourself. Is taking it down 5% going to make us that much more attractive? Well, in many cases, the client themselves, they've got their own zone.
Hmm.
Too little, and it doesn't seem, it's too good to be true. There must be something else going on here, or it's priced out of market. Too
Hmm.
much, and they're not going to consider you. And so
That's
what
right.
I found is that in professional service organizations, many of those sales teams say, you know what, we need to take it down 5%. We need to take it down 10%. When in fact, the client themselves really aren't going to make a move or consider you to be a low cost provider until you reduce it 30%. So all that's really being done is you're giving away that potential profitability and it's going to the ether. Is that right?
Yes, it is exactly right. And I think it's interesting, especially from a professional services point of view. Um, they don't have a good feel for the quality of your delivery if you're doing professional services delivery. So unless you can find a way to do risk transference for them by connecting them to other customers who've done business with you in a professional services context, how do I show that I have a quality product? Well, I say, let me have you talk to three or four customers that will vouch for the type of work that we do. And that will allow them to say, oh, well, maybe they're a little higher than I would like them to be, but I've now transferred the risk of me making a decision to several other references. And so that's how you can exploit that zone of indifference from the buyer's point of view is find good references to make your product look like a value product.
This is so fascinating in that um, I think there is a call to action here, and I don't want to get ahead of the conversation because I want to stay within the zone of indifference for a moment. Uh, because there's a call to action to say there's a different conversation that needs to occur in order to determine how we are going to market with our product. Do I have that right?
Yes, I think that's exactly right. I mean, there's this positioning. So back to value-based pricing, there's a positioning question there as well.
Say more. Give an example.
Well, I mean, let me think about a good example would be I have a product, a physical product that I'm selling,
Hmm.
and maybe it's an electrical kind of product. And it's got some really interesting engineering specs that it very it doesn't generate much heat and it's going to be used usually in enclosed spaces. And so heat thermal signature is really, really important. Well, if you don't actually market that engineering attribute to your customers, they're not going to know about it, right? And so there's this positioning of the product within the market to different types of customers. Some people will value thermal efficiency, and some people will value some other electrical attribute. Maybe it's, well, I just want the latest LED light bulb version, right? Even though it might generate more heat or not any better heat or any less heat. And so that I think is the question is how do you understand what the market values and different customers will have a different value prop for that meets their needs. And that gets back to the zone of indifference. As long as if you have a quality product and a quality delivery and accurate invoicing and all those other attributes, then you've got a home run and you can afford to test the envelope and say, we should be at the higher end of this potential range. If you've got a few potholes here or there that you need to clean up, or you've made a conscious decision, our competitor's better at this, but we're just going to talk about all the other things and ignore our problems, right? That can be a viable business strategy. I've seen customers do that. You emphasize the strengths and you de-emphasize your gaps, and that's how you go to market. And so, but that drives zone of a difference.
It does. It does. Zone of Indifference also takes on not just the what and the value, but also the who inside of the customer or client. Are you seeing that as well?
It does. I mean, you've got to, which persona are you talking to at the client? They will value different things, right? And so you've got to dial that in. I mean, clearly, if you were talking, I'll call it BI products, business intelligence products, and you're trying to sell software into a company, um, certainly the finance team might have a different opinion on what's valuable to them than the procurement team, or the sales op team. Each one would be looking for a different feature set.
I could take that one step further and say that I would think that the finance team would also be interested in the different way that you're trying to sell value into them. In other words, if you're a company that is trying to shift from more the capital sell into
Hmm.
something that is an OpEx sale, that would be interesting to the finance suite and not just the operators that need to take advantage of your new product.
Yeah, that's an interesting extra one, and I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, clearly, what's your monetization strategy even comes into play here, right? How are you trying to sell? You could have some great new AI product. Nobody's come up with any of those lately. There's one a day, it seems like. But how are they planning to monetize this capability, right? How do you want to go to market? Who are you competing with? What are they doing? New product launch is a very interesting thing. But even after the new product launch, there's the question of how do you think you can monetize it with different groups?
Right. And so when we talk about this notion of zone of indifference, it is not just the zone itself, but who is actually making those kind of value
That's right.
judgments as we think about it. And it's the zone of indifference for price, the zone of indifference for capability, the zone of indifference for risk that is
Hmm.
being taken on. So there are a number of very fascinating places that we need to go take a look at. Not that we're trying to create a science fair project out of this, but quite frankly, in shifting to value selling, that zone of
Hmm.
indifference then takes on a number of different facets that need to be reviewed to remain competitive in today's marketplace. And I think that what you did is by saying, well, it's maybe it's not necessarily triggered by AI, but AI most certainly has shined a bright light on what it is we have to look at as we think about taking some of these new products to market.
Yeah. I think that clearly the new product launch, issue is a unique one given the current kind of environment and the speed of change. Um, but even stepping back from the new product launch, the thing that always comes back to my B2C, B2B kind of, there's an existing relationship with the customer. Or at least there's maybe a burgeoning relationship. How mature is that relationship? And what are they likely to give you credit for versus not give you credit for? Um, the one thing there was a piece in LinkedIn, oh, probably maybe a year ago, and I thought it got me thinking about this, and it said it had to do with cigarette companies selling cigarettes, and they said, cigarette companies have this thing down. They're doing everything they can to kill their customers, and yet their profits are growing because every 3 months they have a 2% increase. And that 2% is inside the zone of indifference for somebody who has an addiction to cigarettes. It's not like they're going to stop because you went up 2%. They value that particular brand of cigarette that they really like because they've been, whatever. And so rolling out small incremental uh, increases, if your industry will tolerate that. Well, that defines what incremental duration is. But in the case of the cigarette industry, it was every 3 months we're going up 1 or 2%, and nobody's really going to push back because The frog's in the water and the water's slowly getting warmer, but the frog's not going to get out of the water because it got a little bit warmer.
Mm,
Um, and so, that the frequency at which you can make those changes will be industry driven, no doubt. Um, and it also will have to do with the types of customers. And this is where I go back in my book to the very beginning of my book, and I talk about, you know, annual price list increases, annual general increases. Horrible idea to start with. Do manage things more proactively than that. But at the very least, don't take the broad brush approach and say, well, just take everybody up 4% and then we'll see what sticks, right? And that's why we have price realization metrics, because we know it's not all going to stick. And it's because of zone of indifference. Different customers value your product more than others, even the same product. And so that's the piece where I think it all kind of starts to wrap around. And it says, well, what do you do to maintain that relationship? Um, don't leave money on the table, but don't chase customers away. And lowering price doesn't necessarily bring a lot more revenue in the door, and may not bring any more profits in the door.
right. And so it's it's sort of ironic, isn't it? In that the more that we're being disrupted by technology, the more that AI is showing up, the more that the relationship that currently occurs, or one that has to be built, is going to be the predictor of whether or not we can continue to move along and test that zone of indifference.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean that is the thing, right? Is you've got to have even in well, short of a pure AI to AI, negotiating bot kind of an arrangement, there's some sort of relationship there. And it will be quantified by the human in the loop as long as there's a human in the loop.
Right, right. And with at least with clients I'm serving right now, there are so many tentacles in terms of relationships. We're talking about capital equipment manufacturers in this example, which is there is an operational aspect to it. There is a general management aspect to it. There is an ongoing maintenance and a follow-up aspect to it. There's an implementation aspect to it. And there is a newly introduced this notion of the financial aspect of it, especially as we're going from CapEx to OpEx.
Mhm.
And to think that, yes, AI is the impetus for all of this happening, but it relies on so many people working with people to come up with the right answer that, boy, I know that AI is getting better and better all the time, but it's very difficult for me to see that being disrupted, and quite frankly, that being something that uh, should be ignored in favor of the technology.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the CapEx OpEx piece is a really interesting one. And again, back to who is your audience?
Right.
You know, I when I was a CIO many years ago, um, the CFO told me, Jim, cash is king, right?
Mm-hmm.
He would much prefer to not have CapEx. He wanted to have OpEx, was his point of view. And I was trying to make an argument at the time that no, 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 I can do it this way. And he's like, no. So know what your audience values, right? Tailor your message to the audience that you're talking to. You talk to COOs, they've got a different set of concerns than CFOs. You go to a marketing person and you've got a slightly different set of concerns. So, understand that and what they value. And that is what you have. That's the challenge. It does take some human creativity to figure out what they really value. You can augment that with a data science capability, but and you can look at transactional history and derive some candidates that you can have a conversation about, but that's not the only answer. And understanding that will allow you to use that zone of indifference to your advantage, not to your disadvantage.
And at the risk of trying to treat B2B business as a monolith, and I'm not trying to do that, um, if somebody in the audience is saying, you know what, I need to turn inside my organization and say, we need to stop negotiating with ourselves. We need to put more insight into our annual increases or our renewals. We
Hmm.
need to get better in terms of being able to present an offer that is competitive in the marketplace. And this notion
Hmm.
of zone of indifference is something that we would like to explore. What would you suggest the first step be?
That's a good question. I think it boils down to talking to your customers and seeing what they value. And, I'm going to put on my old manufacturing hat here and my wife's old manufacturing hat. Um, and it's voice of the customer. They're telling you what they value. You just have to listen. Um, they want certain things that you know, and without you listening and engaging in a conversation, you won't know about the things that are on the near horizon that they want input on and they want insight on how you could solve a burgeoning problem for them. And then that's where you bring value to the equation.
So the next set of dollars should be spent on what your relationships look like. If I could put a larger categorical insight in there, is what are our relationships like, and how well do we know our customers? Arriving at a voice of customer or having insights or input from a voice of customer. Do I have that right?
I think so, right? I mean, ultimately, your customers will tell you with fairly good assurance what they are interested in, what problems they need your help to solve. And if you can solve that problem, if you can scratch that itch, then you will be bringing value to that customer and they will be willing to pay a good market price for it. It's only when you start to deliver the substandard solution that price becomes more negotiable. And when you're the absolute low price, you know, product offering in the market, then price is the only value you bring, then you're really at risk.
Absolutely. I've without naming names, I do know that big box retailers buy their salt differently to then
Hmm.
sell to the end consumer. They buy
Yep.
their salt differently, they price it differently, they package it differently because they're trying to make an offer. They're trying to move as much salt as they possibly can. So I found, and give me your reaction, I have found that somebody who claims that they are a commodity product aren't.
No, not generally. Um, they will they will build a brand, perhaps, or a series of offerings that work from a marketing point of view, but underneath the covers, there are profitable products and loss leaders. And the loss leaders, they manage very, very tightly so that they overall are making the revenue mix that they want across the different product lines.
And so, any client or anybody in an organization that says, well, we're really a commodity, we're really a commodity, can't be. Because there are ways of differentiating in the B2C and in the B2B space that actually makes a difference when they think about being competitive in the market. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I've dealt with a number of people who will say, our product is really rather commoditized.
Right.
And and you'll say, so do all your customers pay the same price? And the answer is no. Oh, well, then I guess it's not quite as a commodity as you think it is, right? And price differentiation, natural price differentiation in the market helps you realize that there are some customers out there that value that commoditized item more than other customers who value that commoditized item, which means you're not as much of a commodity as you think.
You bet. Now, let's take that to this notion of the zone of indifference. If you can give me an example, I have found some pretty wide variation within the zone itself. What have you seen?
Very much that, right? Your ability to meet that customer's perceived needs really defines the width of that zone of indifference that they're willing to tolerate a price increase on. All right. So that is the value. So there's a direct correlation between the zone of indifference, that width that you could achieve, and the quality of your total offering to any particular customer. If you are, like I said, if you're the low price, if your claim is to be the low price leader on that box of salt, and that's the only thing you bring, and half the time the box of salt falls apart, and it doesn't seal well, and all these other things, then people will view you as the low price leader, and they will say, I don't want that. I actually want a box of salt that holds together long enough for me to use it till the salt's done. Um,
So I've seen some with clients I've served. Well, I'll say it this way. I've gone into some clients, and the first thing that we do is we try to understand what the variation is for arguably like products or services,
mhm,
and finding out whether or not there is either a segmentation or a portfolio approach to the way that they're looking at their client base. And
mhm,
to the extent that there is one, and small, medium, large, and national accounts isn't necessarily one, but let's say for the moment there is, we start taking a look at the variation in like services or products and saying the variations are significant here. Now, is
mhm.
that because we haven't tested their zone of indifference? Is that because the low end is being done because of somebody, right? The what I call guppies and whales. Well, it's a guppy
Mhm.
now; it'll turn into a whale. To which I respond, well, it's a guppy; it'll become an adult guppy. It'll never become a
Yes.
whale.
Yes.
Right? Is that kind of scrutiny being taken? Because Jim, even in companies that are not doing new product introductions, even in companies that aren't necessarily affected by AI, even in those companies who are not looking to shift the way that they are pricing into value selling, I'm finding that testing the zone of indifference can really tune up the profitability of an organization. You seeing that too?
Yes, absolutely. And and back to your, what just taking customer size as a proxy for the value of that customer to your company, right? Now, there may be other attributes that divide it, but let's assume it's just total sales, right? Um, then you could say, well, yeah, I want to have three or four or five different categories. National accounts might be one. Maybe there's a growth account one where you're trying to get customers in the door and you're going to give them a lower price and slowly you're going to raise their price over time. And that's your market strategy. But once they're not a growth customer and once they're not a national account customer, there's some sort of small, medium, large uh, arrangement of those customers. And you would expect small customers to have at least a slightly higher price than medium customers, if that was your go-to-market strategy. Um, and what we do see is that some customers have done a very good job over time of rewarding larger customers that are more important to them because if they walk away, it creates a big hole that has to be filled by some new sale. And so there's a value in retention, um, and they price accordingly. So yeah, it's a very common practice, and it's not just size that matters. Maybe it's, geography, and maybe it's industry. You could be in the Southeast and be in a highly competitive industry. You could be in the Southeast and be in a very low competitive industry where you can get much higher prices. I mean, one thing I can tell you is I go to Florida. Across every industry I have worked in for 35 years, Florida is the low price market. It's one of the weirdest things. I don't care everything from computer chips to potato chips to fuel pumps to automotive parts to, you know, you name it. Doesn't matter. Window screens, all kinds of things.
Do you have a
Florida is always the,
do you have a hypothesis as to why that is?
I really don't, other than just it's a maybe it has something to do with there are a lot of retirees in Florida, but that doesn't explain the business side of it. So on the B2C side, I could make an argument that people are more price sensitive because they're living on a fixed income or other kinds of things, and that just generally drags down the market. But the B2C side or the B2B side, we see the same thing. I mean, everybody from people who are making windows to trucks to parts of any kind that don't ever go to any consumer. They sit in a factory and they are used by another factory. Um, so, but it's an interesting piece. Understanding that segmentation allows you to say who values this product more. And I had a customer many years ago. I was sitting in a room with the CFO, the CEO, and the head of sales, and the Northeast is always generally priced higher. Well, even if you look at, relative to some list price, you'd say, well, the list multiplier is higher in the Northeast than it is in Florida. Okay. Um, why is that? And we were telling them, these are your least price sensitive customers in the Northeast. You should actually raise their price more because they're the least price sensitive. And the sales guy was having none of it. He was going, no, that doesn't make any sense. And it was one of those rare cases where the CEO was a former pricing person. And he goes, wait a second, maybe we should try this. And, the CFO was like, well, okay, if you think we should try it. And in fact, it worked out famously. So sometimes it provides interesting insights about what customers are willing to pay. And that is tied to that zone of indifference. Oh, you're better meeting their needs. So they're willing to pay slightly more. Not a whole lot. It's not like you're moving it $20. You're moving it, 5 basis points, 10 basis points, but those accumulate.
Mm. Very much like your cigarette example that says that,
Hmm.
look, once they're locked in and they're a client, then they've become comfortable. And quite frankly, going back to the beginning of our conversation, the risk has been reduced
Hmm.
associated with that relationship and their
Hmm.
expectations of how they then work with you.
Hmm.
And it's new and it's valuable. And a lot of what I'm doing with clients right now is helping them get through this notion of what are your value stories, and then being able
Hmm.
to use the value story as the baseline.
Hmm.
Companies that are shifting their capex into opex. Okay, well then what is the value story? And can we measure against the value story rather than the transactional price? And
Hmm.
and it's another client too that wants to go down the VOC path where they're saying, well, if we're able to come back with some better VOC, then we can get into the value story. So VOC drives values. Well, VOC drives the ICP. This is the clients that we want from a portfolio
Hmm.
perspective.
Hmm.
Then let's see if we could drive the value story and start measuring against that, because the ability to, well, for forward thinking organizations, fire their worst customers is something that I find a lot. Most of my clients' voices trail off and go, I could never do that. I still have to
Yeah,
hold them
exactly.
because I have a revenue
Yeah,
number sitting in front of me and blah, 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 blah.
yeah, yeah.
So,
And my comment to that is, well, at least stop selling to them at a loss.
right.
I mean, sometimes, and I think this is a question of value, is you have a utilization target that you have to meet on a plant, right?
Right.
You might be willing to actually sell at a true loss because it helps you cover most of the operation of that plant. So if you have a paper plant or the cost to shut down an oil refinery or a paper plant is enormous and restart it,
Enormous.
right?
Yep.
And so you will do anything in your power to avoid shutting down that paper plant because you want to, there's an avoidance of restart costs. Now, sometimes you want to schedule it in advance and you want to have other capability come online. And so there's, the predictability. So there's value to the customer, to the seller on some customers that you would otherwise say they're not very valuable, but they keep the lights on. And so you have to think about that question when you're talking about value. It's not just the product value to the customer, it's also the customer value to you. And that gets back to, is it just revenue or is it something else that we're sizing customer value on?
Well, see, that's so cool because I've always argued back and forth the notion of how much P&L do you give the sales organization,
Hmm.
right? I'm sure you've been through this too,
Yep.
where it's like, well, they should have their own little P&L. And yes, if they're going to have a set of customers and they want to play the guppies and whales game, then they will be held accountable to it. So
Yeah.
why don't we do
You have a budget you can spend to get that customer in the door if you really want them, right?
right?
Or, you know, I guess, the CFO can have a budget to spend too. It's like, all right, we got to keep this plant running. We're going to take business at a loss right now. And, I tell people this all the time is, we produce price guidance and it's always optimal price guidance. And I mean, one of the things we do is we look at the normal range of business and we trim off the bottom feeders. And we say, well, there was something that was not normal about maybe the bottom 15 or 20% of the market. You took that business deliberately for reasons other than price. So take them out of the equation when I start to produce new price guidance that represents the normal range of business. Go look at the stuff at the bottom and say, what are the attributes of that stuff at the bottom? Why did we take that business? Understand it, right? And
Right.
that could be the definition of, you know, bottom feeder business that we really want to take, right? That's the customer classification.
Yep. And having the customer classification, for whatever reason, I just don't see enough of in the marketplace. Maybe because I'm looking in the wrong places, but it is just that. And I think we've touched on it two or three times in this last hour, which says maybe this is a new classification. Maybe the take it at a loss is a new classification, and then we put some discipline around managing to that. So at least we
Mhm.
understand why we're doing it. And in some cases, it's going to be, well, these are just underperforming sales people that we can fix. And in other cases, there's really good reasons for doing it, and it's part of
Yeah.
it's part of the overall portfolio management.
Yeah, I literally said this to one of our current customers that's doing a price validation point of view. And I said, remind your testers, because they've got sales guys looking at the price guidance and, looking at scatter plots and saying, yeah, that makes sense. Sanity check what we did. And I said, make sure your sales guys understand that I'm not ever going to tell you to not take business below the floor. I'm going to tell you, don't take business below the floor price inadvertently. There may be very, very valid reasons for you to take business that is unprofitable or barely profitable. And Siemens Energy is a good one. Many years ago, when I first started at Zillion, I think my second or third customer, they were selling circuit breakers in the Los Angeles market at minus 200% margin deliberately, because their circuit breakers would only go in their steel boxes, and they were making a handy profit on the big steel box.
Huh.
And so it was a package question, right? So you look at it one way and you'd say, well, there's no reason for you to ever do this. Yes, there is. Okay. What you're telling me is, yes, you'll sell them individually, but they always have to go into your box. That's a reason to sell low. Get people to buy the box. It's kind of like the subscription on, printer ink,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly. Right. There's number 65 is the only one that fits in that particular
Hmm.
printer, and you got to keep printing. So,
Yep. Yep.
right.
Yeah. So
So,
look at the mix of products and those kinds of things. And Do I want to take that business? Yes. Maybe it's utilization. Maybe it's a subscription revenue stream. Maybe there are other reasons for you to do this, but don't say no to that price. Don't say no, don't say yes inadvertently.
Right.
Don't say no just because it's below the floor.
Right. But if you're going to say yes, it needs to be ultimately visible and managed. What else should be considered when thinking about value selling and how the zone of indifference plays?
I think one thing that people often overlook from a big picture company perspective is the idea that you can make it up on volume, right? We all smile when we hear this phrase. Oh, don't, yeah, we'll cut the price, but we'll make it up on volume. Well, it's very, very, very rare that if you have very steep discounts, that you're going to sell enough at the new, much lower price than you might break even on revenue, but you won't break even on profits. And so the question is thinking about, should I be running steep promotions, right? Because that takes me out of that zone of indifference and says, oh, but there are going to be enough people who are willing to say, this is such a great deal. I'm going to take that risk of changing out my supplier for this product or this service and go whole hog and use you to displace another vendor. Um, Raising your price too much is going to cause people to shop your business. Lowering your price too much, you'll get some new customers in, but you won't be making the same unit profit, and it's very difficult to break even on big discounts. Um, so the zone of indifference can work to your advantage to get people to move, but don't expect it to be profitable movement in the short term. You may be able to grow that demand, that new demand, by slowly raising their price, kind of like a growth account, get somebody in the door, and then slowly boil the frog. But you know, that's where you can use the zone of indifference, but it's not going to pay off quickly on the profit side of the ledger.
Well, that brings up a different topic, which to me is non trivial, and that has to do with discipline. If I
Hmm.
heard correctly by what you were saying, if we are going to take those kinds of discounts in order to take market share or to penetrate new accounts, whatever explanation is
Right.
used,
Hmm.
strikes me that making a move like that demands that there is some discipline associated with the pricing and the care and feeding associated with that relationship to move it to a place where it's actually going to be worthy, if you will,
Hmm.
of being one of our customers.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And maybe it ties to another piece of this, at least in my head, that there's more to the value equation than just price. So don't go to lowering price as your primary means to get market share. You can leverage it, certainly not your only means to get leverage or get market share. But if what you're trying to do is break into a new market, having an extremely low price with nothing else going along with that isn't going to get you there, right? So what else can you offer to customers to get them in the door besides just a price concession? Maybe it's training for their sales reps on how to use this new piece of equipment. Put them into some marketing plan where they get access to something else that they value, and then you don't have to have the concession solely on the price side.
Well, we're coming down to time here, Jim. What else should we be talking about when we think of zone of indifference and value selling?
Um, Start small, I think, right? Don't think that you're going to solve world hunger in one step. This is a new muscle for people to exercise. Um, Start laying out what you want to know about your customers. do your homework with those customers, hear what they have to say, hear the problems that they're solving, and then go back and look at your products and say, are there features in my products that my customers don't value? In other words, they're not willing to pay for them, and all I'm doing is raising my cost. Well, then maybe I need a different version of that product for that customer set. And so there's a product rationalization question that goes into this as well, right? Which customers, which products, what opportunities, and how does that impact what you can do in the market to get access to other market share or to improve profitability? It's not always as my good friend Barrett Thompson said, not everything that masquerades as a pricing problem is in fact a pricing problem.
And if we try to solve everything with price, it's going to be really expensive.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
So these new disciplines that we're talking about, it's about marketing, it's about product, it's about relationships and clients, it's about portfolio management. Certainly pricing sits at the hub because it is where the rubber hits the road and where we understand where transactions are, but it's really knitting all of those pieces together. My question then is it worth it?
It's absolutely worth it, but I wouldn't say I don't put pricing at the center of the wheel. I say that pricing cannot be successful. You cannot deliver a set of pricing into the market without governance between all of the natural power centers of a business on what they want to do in the market. If you go to procurement, if you go to finance, if you go to sales, if you go to operations, if you go to warehousing, if you're all trying to do something different and if you don't have vision lock on where the company wants to go and how it wants to be slightly different, say in the Northeast versus the Southwest, then it will be impossible for sales to build a go-to-market pricing strategy that meets your undefined business intent. And so I don't see it at the middle. I see it as the orchestrator of all of these. But until that results in vision lock on where you want to go, pricing can't deliver on that. They need to facilitate it and help build that vision, but they ultimately can't deliver their part of the puzzle without all of the natural power centers being aligned on what to do and how you want to do it.
Well, Jim, I want to thank you for providing a shameless self-promotion for chiefpricingofficer.com. That is the conversation that we are trying to foment to elevate and celebrate what it is to be a leader in pricing, and that is to be that connective tissue among all those pieces. And I love that phrase, vision lock, so that pricing can actually go and do its job.
Hey, it's been great. I've enjoyed the conversation. I look forward to more.
Yeah, absolutely. Jim, thank you so much. Let me try to conclude with the following. The implications of what we've been talking about, that is the zone of indifference and value selling, are fairly straightforward. Stop negotiating with yourself, lead with value, not cost, position price deliberately within that zone of indifference, to strengthen the value communication before discussing price. Understand what your customers are looking for and what they value. Understand which customers have room to move and why. What do they value? Segment intelligently, manage price realization with discipline, not with fear, because the truth is simple. You rarely lose on price, you lose on value perception. And that's entirely within your power to change. Jim, this has been wonderful. Do appreciate it. Take care, sir.
John, thank you very much.